It is July 4th, 1997. Inside an operating room in Mexico City, a man lies under the effects of anesthesia, his face disfigured by the intervention of a team of plastic surgeons. For 8 hours, they have been working to erase his identity, to sculpt a new face that will allow him to escape the greatest manhunt on the continent. This man is no common criminal. He is the most powerful drug trafficker in the world, a ghost who commands an invisible empire from the skies. But something goes terribly wrong. In the stillness of the recovery room, his heart stops. The news leaks to the world. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the legendary Lord of the Skies, has died. However, his death, far from closing a chapter, opens an abyss of doubts and mysteries. Was it truly heart failure or a silent execution on the operating table? Who really was this man who hid his face from the world while flooding its streets with cocaine? Was he solely a ruthless drug baron, an architect of violence and corruption, or an unprecedented business genius, a visionary strategist who revolutionized organized crime on a global scale? Join me as we delve into the origins of the man who, with his fleet of planes and his silent cunning, became one of the most enigmatic and feared figures in the history of drug trafficking. Before we immerse ourselves in the life of the man who conquered the skies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that have forged our world. And tell us in the comments, do you believe Amado Carrillo Fuentes was a product of his environment, a criminal genius, or simply a monster whose ambition knew no bounds? The legend of the Lord of the Skies did not begin in the heights, but on the dusty earth of Sinaloa, the epicenter of drug trafficking in Mexico. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born on December 17, 1956, in Guamuchilito, a small and humble village in the municipality of Navolato. He was the eldest of 11 siblings, born into a family that, like so many others in the region, lived at the crossroads between agriculture and crime. His father, Vicente Carrillo Vega, was a farmer of humble descent, while his mother, Aurora Fuentes, dedicated her life to raising their numerous offspring. However, Amado's destiny would not be forged in the cornfields, but in the shadow of a much more influential figure. His uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Neto. Don Neto was one of the pioneers of large-scale drug trafficking in Mexico, a founding member of the Juarez Cartel, the country's first criminal superorganization. For a young Amado, growing up witnessing the power, wealth, and respect his uncle commanded was a formative lesson. The life of a peasant was one of hard work and meager rewards. The life of a drug trafficker, conversely, offered a brutal shortcut to absolute power. From a very young age, Amado displayed a sharp intelligence and a reserved, observant nature. Unlike other young men who sought notoriety through impulsive violence, he was calculating. He learned the fundamentals of the business from the bottom up, starting with minor tasks under Don Neto's tutelage. He was not a bloodthirsty hitman, but a diligent apprentice, a student of the logistics of crime. His first great lesson was on the importance of discretion. He watched as the most ostentatious capos attracted the attention of the authorities, while the shrewdest operated from the shadows. This philosophy would become his trademark. While others built empires upon public intimidation, Amado would build his upon silent corruption and business efficiency. His formal entry into the Juarez Cartel in the 1980s was not as a gunman, but as a cog in the vast machinery of transport. It was here that he began to familiarize himself with aviation, the field he would one day dominate completely. He supervised the shipments, coordinated the routes of the light aircraft crossing the border, and learned every detail of the supply chain. It was meticulous work that required a mind for logistics and a capacity for strategic planning. Skills Amado possessed in abundance. His mentors, in addition to his uncle, were the titans of the cartel: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the boss of bosses, and Rafael Caro Quintero. From Félix Gallardo, he learned the importance of criminal diplomacy and the necessity of corrupting the highest spheres of political and police power. From Caro Quintero, the audacity to operate on a massive scale. But Amado was not a simple imitator. He was an innovator. He observed, learned, and silently planned how to improve the system, how to make it bigger, faster, and above all, more profitable. The fall of the Guadalajara cartel, precipitated by the kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985, was the catalyst that transformed Amado from a promising lieutenant into a capo in his own right. While his bosses were hunted down and imprisoned and their empire fragmented into rival fiefdoms, Amado saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. Chaos was a ladder and he was ready to ascend. The 1980s was the golden age of the Guadalajara cartel, a federation of traffickers that monopolized the drug trade in Mexico under the leadership of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. For Amado Carrillo Fuentes, this was his training ground, his university of crime. He did not rise through brute force, but through his intelligence and unparalleled capacity for logistics. Félix Gallardo, the visionary boss of bosses, had designed a system of plazas, territories controlled by his lieutenants that guaranteed the flow of drugs northward. Amado, under the protection of his uncle Don Neto, was assigned to Ojinaga, Chihuahua, a key border plaza. His task was to supervise the smuggling of marijuana and cocaine into Texas. It was here that he perfected his skills, not as a warrior, but as an operations manager. He learned to coordinate pilots, secure clandestine airstrips, and, most importantly, weave a web of corruption involving local and federal police commanders, as well as customs officials on both sides of the border. His style was radically different from his contemporaries. While other capos reveled in violence and ostentation, Amado cultivated a low profile. He was known for his serene demeanor and cerebral approach. He didn't waste time on extravagant parties or ego disputes. His mind was always on the business: how to optimize routes, minimize risks, and maximize profits. This discretion earned him the trust of Félix Gallardo, who saw in him a reliable and efficient operator, a businessman in a world of bandits. The relationship with the Colombian cartels was fundamental to his development. Initially, the Mexicans were mere transporters for the powerful Medellin and Cali cartels. They received a flat fee for every kilo they managed to cross into the United States. Amado, however, saw the weakness in this arrangement. He understood that true power did not lie in production, but in distribution. While working under the orders of Pablo Escobar Gaviria and the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, he studied their methods and, more importantly, their vulnerabilities. He realized that the pressure from the DEA and the Colombian government on Medellin and Cali created an opportunity for the Mexicans to assume a more dominant role. The turning point came with the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena in 1985 and the crime bear, ordered by the leaders of the Guadalajara cartel in an act of excessive arrogance, unleashed the fury of the U.S. government. Operation Legend was the largest manhunt in DEA history, and one by one, the pillars of the cartel began to fall. Rafael Caro Quintero was arrested in Costa Rica. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo was captured in Puerto Vallarta. Finally, in 1989, Felix Gallardo himself was detained. From prison, the boss of bosses attempted to maintain control, convening a summit in Acapulco where he divided his empire among the remaining factions. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Hector El Güero Palma were assigned the Sinaloa Corridor, the Arellano Felix brothers, the coveted Tijuana Plaza. To Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who had proven to be the shrewdest and most discreet operator, he entrusted control of Ciudad Juárez. It was a decision that would forever change the map of drug trafficking. The Juárez Plaza, which had been controlled by Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, was a prize of incalculable value. Its proximity to El Paso, Texas, made it the most strategic smuggling corridor on the entire continent. Amado was not willing to share power. He saw that the era of federations was over, and that the future belonged to unified, hierarchical cartels. The Guadalajara cartel was dead, and from its ashes, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was preparing to build his own empire. One that would not be limited to the earth, but would dominate the skies. With the fall of the Guadalajara cartel leaders, the gentleman's pact that had maintained a fragile peace between the various factions was shattered. Felix Gallardo's plaza system disintegrated, giving way to an era of fierce competition and turf wars. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, now at the helm of the Juárez Plaza, knew that to survive and prosper, he could not limit himself to being just another heir. He had to be the sole king. His first obstacle was the man who officially controlled Juárez, Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, the former commander of Mexico's Federal Security Directorate, DFS, a notoriously corrupt intelligence agency that had served as the protective arm of the Guadalajara cartel. Aguilar Guajardo was a vestige of the old order, a man representing the symbiosis between the state and crime that Felix Gallardo had perfected. But Amado represented the new order, a criminal entrepreneur whose loyalty was solely to capital. In 1993, the transition of power was resolved in the only way the narco world understands. While Aguilar Guajardo was vacationing with his family in Cancun, he was ambushed and assassinated in broad daylight by hitmen. Although never conclusively proven, in the underworld it was taken for granted that the order came from Amado Carrillo Fuentes. With this act of surgical and ruthless violence, Amado not only eliminated his main rival, but sent an unequivocal message to the rest of the capos. Juárez belonged to him. Thus, the Juárez Cartel was formally born. Under Amado's leadership, the organization transformed from a simple smuggling network into a multinational criminal corporation. His first and most crucial innovation was redefining the relationship with Colombian suppliers. Leveraging the growing U.S. pressure on the Cali and Medellin cartels, Amado changed the rules of the game. He would no longer accept cash payments for transporting cocaine. Instead, he demanded a percentage of the product, generally between 40% and 50%. This meant that for every 2 kilos of cocaine he transported for the Colombians, he kept almost 1 kilo for his own distribution network in the United States. This bold move transformed him from a simple transporter into a majority partner, giving him unprecedented control over the U.S. market and multiplying his profits exponentially. To handle this vast new operation, Amado built a hierarchical and disciplined structure. He recruited his brothers, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the Viceroy, and Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, the Golden Boy, as his most trusted lieutenants, ensuring loyalty within his inner circle. But his genius lay in his ability to go beyond family ties. He created an empire based on efficiency and systemic corruption. His protection network was legendary. He boasted of having army generals, governors, federal and state police chiefs, and countless lower-ranking officials on his payroll. His influence reached its peak with the alleged infiltration of the Office of Mexico's anti-drug czar, General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, who was arrested in 1997 for his links to Carrillo. This level of corruption guaranteed that his operations ran with almost industrial fluidity, with convoys of drugs moving across the country, with police escorts, and with inside information on every movement of law enforcement. Amado was a master of anonymity. While rivals like El Chapo Guzman or the Arellano Felix brothers cultivated an image of violent outlaws, he strove to remain invisible, a shadowy figure whose power was felt everywhere but whose face was practically unknown. This strategy allowed him to operate for years with near-total impunity, solidifying his control over the Juarez corridor and laying the groundwork for the feat that would make him a legend. The consolidation of power in the Juarez Cartel was only the prelude to Amado Carrillo Fuentes' true stroke of genius, the innovation that not only redefined his career, but fundamentally altered the scale and mechanics of global drug trafficking. This was the creation of a vast aerial fleet that earned him his immortal nickname, the Lord of the Skies. Before Carrillo, air smuggling was primarily conducted with Cessna and Piper light aircraft, capable of carrying a few hundred kilos of cocaine per trip. These short-range aircraft had to make multiple stops, fly low to avoid radar, and faced a high risk of interdiction. It was an effective method on a small scale, but inefficient for Amado's ambitions. He didn't think in kilos, he thought in tons. His vision was to transform drug trafficking from an artisanal business into an operation of industrial caliber. To achieve this, he began acquiring large passenger and cargo planes, many purchased at auctions of bankrupt airlines in the United States. His fleet included aircraft such as the Sud Aviation Caravelle, the Douglas DC-8, and most notoriously, several Boeing 727s. These planes, which once carried hundreds of passengers on commercial routes, were modified in secret hangars. Seats and all non-essential equipment were stripped out to maximize cargo space. A single Boeing 727 could carry between 10 and 15 tons of cocaine in a single flight, an amount that would have required dozens of trips by light aircraft. The operation was of breathtaking audacity. Flights departed from Colombia or Venezuela, loaded to the brim with merchandise from the Cali Cartel. They flew at high altitudes, often using fake or cloned flight plans to pose as legitimate commercial flights. Their destination was clandestine airstrips built in the middle of the Chihuahua Desert, or on remote ranches owned by the cartel. Amado's corruption network ensured that military and civilian radars were conveniently ignored, and that any police or military presence in the zone was diverted. Upon landing in Mexico, an army of workers unloaded the cocaine in a matter of minutes, transferring it to a fleet of trucks that would take it to secure warehouses near the border. From there, the drugs were introduced into the United States through tunnels, secret compartments in commercial vehicles, or by bribing border agents. The system was a masterpiece of criminal logistics. It allowed Carrillo to move quantities of drugs previously unimaginable with unprecedented speed and efficiency. It is estimated that at its peak, the Juarez Cartel transported 4 times more cocaine into the U.S. than any other criminal group. This logistical supremacy generated a fortune that defied comprehension. By the mid-1990s, the DEA estimated that Amado Carrillo Fuentes' earnings exceeded $25 billion, making him one of the richest men in the world. His wealth was so vast that the problem wasn't earning it, but laundering and hiding it. He owned ranches, mansions, fleets of luxury cars, a private zoo, and, according to rumors, even a soccer team. However, true to his style, he avoided ostentation. He lived a nomadic life between his multiple properties, using a series of aliases and maintaining an extremely small circle of trust. He was a billionaire ghost, a CEO managing his empire from the shadows. The Lord of the Skies was not just a nickname, it was the literal description of his power. He had conquered the airspace, turning it into his private superhighway for drug trafficking, and in doing so, he had risen to a level of power and wealth that no other capo had ever reached. The reign of Amado Carrillo Fuentes as the Lord of the Skies was not peaceful. His meteoric rise and near-monopolistic dominance of the Juarez corridor inevitably put him on a collision course with other emerging powers in Mexican drug trafficking. The disintegration of the Guadalajara cartel had not only created opportunities, but also bloody rivalries that would define the criminal landscape for decades. His main adversary was the Tijuana cartel, led by the violent and flamboyant Arellano Felix brothers, Ramon, Benjamin, Francisco Javier, and Eduardo. While Amado preferred discretion and business strategy, the Arellano Felix clan ruled their plaza with ostentatious brutality, delighting in public violence and terror. The war between Juarez and Tijuana was one of the bloodiest in narco history. The dispute was not just over control of routes, but over a philosophy of power. The Arellano Felix brothers viewed Carrillo as an upstart and despised his low-profile approach. Carrillo, in turn, considered them reckless thugs whose violence attracted unnecessary attention from authorities. The war was fought on multiple fronts, from the streets of Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez to tourist hubs like Puerto Vallarta. A notorious episode occurred in November 1992, when hitmen for Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, then an ally of Carrillo, attempted to assassinate Ramon Arellano Felix at a disco in Puerto Vallarta, resulting in a massive shootout that left several dead. The Arellano Felix retaliation was equally brutal, culminating in the infamous shootout at the Guadalajara airport in May 1993, where they attempted to kill El Chapo, but ended up mistakenly assassinating Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, a crime that shocked Mexico and put all the capos in the government's crosshairs. Another formidable rival was the incipient Sinaloa cartel, under the leadership of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Although Guzmán had initially worked in alliance with Carrillo, his ambition and desire to control his own transport routes led to an inevitable fracture. El Chapo, a master of terrestrial logistics through his famous tunnels, envied Carrillo's aerial dominance. The relationship between the two was a complex mix of cooperation and conflict. Sometimes they worked together, sharing intelligence and routes, but distrust was always present. Each knew that ultimately, only one could be the true king of drug trafficking. Tension erupted on several occasions with betrayals and clashes between their respective lieutenants. The rivalry between Carrillo and Guzman was a strategic chess match, a struggle between the king of the air and the king of the tunnels. Internationally, Amado's relationship with his Colombian partners also evolved. With the fall of Pablo Escobar in 1993 and the subsequent dismantling of the Cali cartel, the power of the Colombian producers diminished drastically. Amado capitalized on this situation to further consolidate his position. He was no longer a partner, he was the boss. The Colombians now depended almost entirely on his infrastructure to get their product to the most lucrative market in the world. This allowed him to dictate terms, keeping an ever larger portion of the profits and establishing the Juarez Cartel as the most powerful drug trafficking organization on the planet. To maintain his empire, Amado unleashed selective but terrifying violence. His preferred method was not the massive shootout, but the silent execution. His enemies simply disappeared. He became famous for the Golden Triangle of Death, a desert zone in Chihuahua where hundreds of bodies were found, many showing signs of extreme torture. These were the bodies of rivals, traitors and officials who had refused to cooperate. Through this calculated brutality, Amado maintained discipline within his organization and sent a chilling message to his enemies. Despite his immense power, Amado lived like a prisoner of his own creation, constantly looking over his shoulder. Trapped in a web of fragile alliances and deadly hatreds. By the mid-1990s, the name Amado Carrillo Fuentes, once a whisper in intelligence circles, became the priority target for anti-drug agencies in the United States and Mexico. His aerial empire, moving tons of cocaine with the regularity of a commercial airline, represented a humiliation and a direct threat to the national security of both countries. Political pressure on Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo to act against the Juarez Cartel was immense. In response, a manhunt of unprecedented scale was launched, a joint operation seeking to dismantle the organization from the top down. The DEA, utilizing its vast network of informants and advanced surveillance technology, began mapping the cartel structure. They focused on his finances, tracking the flow of billions of dollars through a complex network of shell companies, exchange houses, and corrupt banks. Operation Zero Impunity was designed to financially strangle Carrillo, freezing his assets and cutting his money laundering lines. In Mexico, the army was deployed to the streets of Ciudad Juárez and other cartel strongholds. Checkpoints were established, properties were raided, and surveillance was intensified at airports and in the airspace. However, Amado's corruption network was so deep that he was often alerted to operations hours or even days in advance. Informants within police and military agencies allowed him to always stay one step ahead of his pursuers. This ability to evade capture became part of his legend, fueling the image of an untouchable ghost. Despite his success in evading capture, the constant pressure began to take its toll. Amado was forced to abandon his life of relative luxury and adopt the existence of a fugitive. He could no longer reside in his opulent ranches or move freely. He spent his days hiding in a series of safe houses, constantly changing locations and communicating via a system of messengers to avoid the interception of his calls. Paranoia became his constant companion. He distrusted everyone, even his closest circle. He knew that the reward for his head, which amounted to millions of dollars, was too great a temptation for many. The net tightened dramatically in February 1997 with the arrest of General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, Mexico's anti-drug czar. The revelation that the man in charge of fighting drug trafficking in the country was actually on Amado Carrillo Fuentes' payroll was a scandal of seismic proportions. It demonstrated the astounding depth of the cartel's corruption. But it was also a devastating blow to Amado. With the fall of his highest-level protector, he lost his main shield against the state. The new anti-drug czar, Mariano Herran Salvati, arrived with the determination to clean up corruption and capture Carrillo at all costs. The hunt became personal. Raids became more frequent and precise. On one occasion, the military stormed his sister's wedding in Guamuchilito, Sinaloa, forcing Amado, who was allegedly present, to narrowly escape. He felt cornered. His face, though not widely known to the public, was now the most wanted by all intelligence agencies. The only way out he saw was to disappear completely, erase his identity, and start over. It was this desperation that led him to make the riskiest decision of his life, to undergo radical plastic surgery to change his face and body. A final attempt to cheat death and the law. The man who had ruled the skies was now trapped on the earth, and his only escape route was through a surgeon's scalpel. The pressure was unbearable. With the Mexican army and the DEA nipping at his heels, and the loss of his main protector, General Gutierrez Rebollo, Amado Carrillo Fuentes knew his time as the invisible capo was coming to an end. He lived in a state of constant paranoia, jumping between hideouts in Mexico, Chile, and Argentina. His vast empire, which once operated with clockwork precision, was now threatened by the imminent capture of its leader. It was in this state of desperation that he made a drastic and fatal decision. He decided to undergo extreme plastic surgery to permanently alter his appearance and liposuction to change his physical build. His plan was to create a new identity, vanish from the public eye, and continue directing his empire from total and renewed anonymity. On July 3, 1997, under an alias, Amado Carrillo Fuentes checked into the Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico City. The operation, which began that night and extended for more than 8 hours into the early morning of July 4th, was a clandestine, high-risk procedure. The medical team was led by plastic surgeon Ricardo Reyes Rincon, who brought in other specialists to carry out the complex intervention. The morning after the surgery, while recovering in a private room, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was declared dead. The official cause was a heart attack, allegedly triggered by an adverse reaction to pain medication or the anesthetic itself. The news shocked the world. The most powerful drug trafficker on the planet, a man who had evaded armies and intelligence agencies, had been defeated not by a bullet, but on an operating table. However, the official version was met with immediate and widespread skepticism. The inconsistencies and unanswered questions fueled a wave of conspiracy theories. How was it possible that a 40-year-old man in apparent good health died of cardiac arrest during an elective procedure? Many believed the death was not accidental. A popular theory suggested he was murdered by his own bodyguards, possibly in collusion with rival capos who wanted to seize his empire. Another hypothesis pointed to an extrajudicial execution by Mexican or U.S. government agents, who would have preferred to eliminate him silently rather than face a public trial that could expose corruption in the highest spheres of power. The boldest and most persistent theory was that Amado Carrillo Fuentes never died. According to this version, the death was a masterful hoax. The body was not his, but that of a double. The surgery was the perfect alibi to fake his own death and retire with his fortune of billions of dollars to live in some remote location, free from persecution. This theory gained traction due to the authorities' initial refusal to allow a clear visual identification of the body and the shadowy nature of the entire affair. The mystery deepened 4 months later, in November 1997. The bodies of the 3 surgeons who had participated in the operation, along with that of a 4th associate, were found inside steel barrels filled with concrete, abandoned on the side of a highway. The corpses showed signs of brutal torture. Their hands were tied behind their backs, their eyes blindfolded, and they had been strangled. This macabre discovery was interpreted in various ways. For some, it was the cartel's revenge, blaming the doctors for the negligence that caused their leader's death. For others, it was an act of cleaning house, the elimination of the only witnesses who could confirm if Amado was truly dead or if they had helped orchestrate his disappearance. To this day, the death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes remains one of the greatest enigmas in the history of organized crime. Although DNA tests and fingerprints officially confirmed his identity, the shadow of doubt has never completely dissipated, cementing his status as a legend, a ghost who perhaps, just perhaps, pulled off the ultimate escape. The sudden and mysterious disappearance of Amado Carrillo Fuentes from the chessboard of drug trafficking did not bring peace. On the contrary, the death of the Lord of the Skies created a massive power vacuum that unleashed one of the most violent eras in Mexico's history. The Juarez Cartel, an organization that had been held together by the strategic vision and iron grip of a single man, suddenly found itself leaderless. Immediately, a brutal internal war for succession broke out. The main faction was led by Amado's younger brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Viceroy. Vicente, who had been second in command, attempted to assume control, but he lacked the charisma, strategic intelligence, and respect that his brother commanded. Other factions within the cartel, led by ambitious lieutenants, refused to accept his leadership, leading to a series of internal purges, betrayals, and assassinations. The cohesion that had made the Juarez Cartel a nearly invincible money-making machine evaporated, and the organization began to fragment into a confederation of warring bands. This internal chaos was the golden opportunity his rivals had been waiting for. The Tijuana cartel of the Arellano Felix brothers, and, above all, the Sinaloa cartel of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada launched an all-out offensive to seize the valuable routes that once belonged to Carrillo. Ciudad Juarez, which under Amado's reign had maintained a semblance of peace controlled by the cartel, transformed into a battlefield. The homicide rate skyrocketed to terrifying levels, turning the border city into one of the most dangerous in the world. The war for control of the Juarez Plaza between the weakened local cartel and the Sinaloa cartel would last for more than a decade, leaving a toll of tens of thousands dead. Amado's fall marked a fundamental turning point in Mexican drug trafficking. The power, which had been concentrated in Juarez, began to shift back toward Sinaloa. El Chapo Guzman, with his genius for logistics and willingness to use extreme violence, emerged as the natural heir to the throne. He learned Amado's lessons on the importance of diversification and large-scale corruption, but combined them with a much more aggressive territorial expansion strategy. The era of discreet, low-profile capos personified by Carrillo had ended. The new era would be one of narco-celebrities, capos whose violence and spectacular escapes would turn them into pop culture figures. The Juarez Cartel, although weakened, did not disappear completely. Under the leadership of the Viceroy, it continued to operate, albeit as a shadow of its former self. it became involved in a bloody war against its former armed wing, La Linea, and found itself increasingly marginalized by the might of Sinaloa and later by the rise of new and more brutal groups like Los Zetas. The structure of organized crime in Mexico became more complex and fragmented. The old guard of capos, who in their own way followed certain codes, was replaced by a new generation of criminals, for whom indiscriminate violence against the civilian population was a standard business tool. The immediate legacy of Amado's death was, therefore, a spiral of violence and chaos. His empire, built on a foundation of logistical efficiency and corruption, proved unsustainable without his centralized leadership. By removing the king, law enforcement did not destroy the kingdom. They simply opened it up to a bloody conquest by more savage warrior princes. The relative peace that his power had imposed was replaced by a war of all against all. A conflagration that continues to burn in Mexico to this day and is, in many ways, the most enduring echo of the collapse of the Lord of the Skies Empire. The legacy of Amado Carrillo Fuentes transcends his mysterious death and the chaos that followed. His impact on the world of organized crime was so profound that his innovations continue to be the gold standard for large-scale drug trafficking operations. He was more than a simple capo. He was a revolutionary of crime, a CEO who transformed a smuggler's business into a global logistics industry. His main contribution was undoubtedly the professionalization of drug transport. The creation of his fleet of Boeing 727s, the fleet of the skies, was a quantum leap in the history of drug trafficking. He demonstrated that it was possible to move volumes of product on an industrial scale, far surpassing the limitations of light aircraft and speedboats. This model of massive aerial transport was studied and emulated by criminal organizations around the world, from the Mexican cartels that succeeded him to trafficking networks in Europe and Asia. He changed the perception of what was logistically possible, establishing a new paradigm of efficiency and profitability. Beyond his logistical genius, Carrillo perfected the art of systemic corruption. While other capos bribed individuals, Amado corrupted entire institutions. His capacity to infiltrate the highest levels of Mexico's government, army, and police, exemplified by his relationship with anti-drug czar Gutierrez Rebollo, was unprecedented. He created a parallel narco-state that operated in the shadow of the legitimate state, ensuring his empire was protected from within. This model of state co-optation has become a fundamental strategy for major cartels who understand that territorial control is impossible without control of political and security structures. His philosophy of business first, violence second also left a mark. Unlike his more impulsive rivals, Carrillo understood violence not as a show of power, but as a tool of last resort that attracted unwanted attention. His reign in Juarez, though brutal at its core, was relatively peaceful on the surface compared to the open warfare that characterized Tijuana or Sinaloa at the time. He preferred silver to lead, plata o plomo, using his immense wealth to buy loyalties and neutralize threats silently. This narco-capitalist approach influenced a new generation of criminal leaders who viewed themselves more as businessmen than outlaws. Outside the underworld, the figure of Amado Carrillo Fuentes has become a myth. His nickname, the Lord of the Skies, is one of the most evocative and recognizable in the history of crime. It perfectly encapsulates the scale of his ambition and the aura of mystery he cultivated in life, which was magnified by his death. This legend has been exploited extensively in popular culture. The hit television series El Señor de los Cielos transformed him from a shadowy and largely invisible criminal into a charismatic and glamorous anti-hero, a fictional figure that, although inspired by his life, often eclipses the much darker and more violent reality of his actions. This romanticization has contributed to a dangerous narco-culture that glorifies traffickers as symbols of power and rebellion, especially among young people in the marginalized communities from which he himself came. In the end, his legacy is a paradox. He was an architect of chaos, whose criminal enterprise unleashed incalculable violence and corroded the foundations of Mexican society. Yet simultaneously, he was an undeniable innovator, a brilliant strategist whose tactics and business models are studied by both crime-fighting agencies and criminals, seeking to emulate his success. Amado Carrillo Fuentes demonstrated that the leader of a modern criminal organization needs to be as much a general as a chief executive officer, a master of violence, and above all, a visionary of logistics. At the end of this journey through the life and death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, we confront the same question that arose in that operating room in Mexico City. Who really was the man behind the legend? The answer is as complex and contradictory as his own story. He was not simply a criminal. He was a phenomenon, a turning point in the history of global organized crime. On one hand, it is impossible to ignore the visionary. Carrillo was a logistics genius, an entrepreneur who saw a market opportunity and exploited it with an efficiency and scale his contemporaries could barely imagine. He transformed the Juarez Cartel into a multinational corporation with a supply chain, a distribution network, and an institutional protection system that rivaled those of any state. His cerebral approach and preference for strategy over brute force distinguished him from the capos of his time. In a world defined by impulsive violence, he was a cold calculator, a chess player always thinking several moves ahead. He was, in the strictest sense, a successful capitalist whose product happened to be cocaine. However, this portrait of the business genius is inseparable from the monster. The empire he built was cemented upon an ocean of blood and suffering. The efficiency of his logistics translated into a flood of drugs that devastated entire communities on both sides of the border. The peace he maintained in his territories was the peace of tyranny, imposed through fear, torture, and assassination. Hundreds, if not thousands of people were executed and disappeared under his reign. His network of corruption was not a simple act of bribery. It was a deliberate assault on the sovereignty and the integrity of a nation, rotting its institutions from the inside and leaving scars that endure to this day. The figure of Amado Carrillo Fuentes forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that intelligence and vision can be placed at the service of the profoundest evil. He was not a simple bandit produced by poverty. He was a man with options who consciously chose a path of mass destruction for personal ambition. He was not a Robin Hood robbing the rich to give to the poor. He was a magnate who amassed one of the world's largest fortunes at the cost of addiction, violence, and social disintegration. His story is a warning about the seductive power of crime and the ease with which the line between business and brutality can vanish. In the end, the Lord of the Skies may have conquered the airspace, but he remained a prisoner on Earth, trapped by the same paranoia and violence he used to build his empire. His death, whether by accident, murder, or a masterful escape, is a fittingly ambiguous ending for a man who lived his life in the shadows. His legacy is not written in the history books of great entrepreneurs, but in forensic reports and in the scars of a war he helped create and that has not yet ended. Thank you for making it this far. We hope this journey through the life and legacy of Amado Carrillo Fuentes has offered you a clearer perspective on the complex history of drug trafficking. If you found this analysis captivating and want to keep exploring the figures and events that have forged the world, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming stories. See you in the next one.